So this is the beautiful location that we're shooting in this morning and doing this test. It's the banks of the River Wear on the Prebend Bridge just in the city of Durham in northeast England. It's an absolutely gorgeous, iconic photographic location, and if you're in this part of the world, it's well worth a little visit. You can walk down the banks of the river down to the weir, and there's some fantastic shots there. I'll pop a few at the end of the video so you can see them. So a very good morning from County Durham. We're in an absolutely gorgeous location, not far from our new home in County Durham, northeast England. And today we're going to do a comparison of the X-T2 and the X-H2 in terms of ISO invariance. If you remember from my last video, we shot both of these cameras up to high ISOs to compare the difference, and the X-T2 was the clear winner. Now that's obviously because the X-T2 has a lower pixel count in the same area of the sensor, so that was a predictable result. The X-T2 was about one stop better in high ISO. Once you got above about 3200 it becomes sort of more noticeable, but it was about a one stop difference. So today we're going to look at the invariance capabilities of these cameras. Now ISO invariance, if you're not aware of it, I'll put it sort of fairly simple because I don't really know how it works myself. But modern sensors don't necessarily have to use ISO to increase their sensitivity. You can do it in post-production using Lightroom or Photoshop, a raw converter basically. The concept is that you shoot underexposed, say 1, 2, 4 stops underexposed, and then you increase it 1, 2, 4 stops in your post-production. The advantage of this is that if you're in a situation where, for example, you need to maintain a high shutter speed but need a low ISO for the quality, you can do that and not sacrifice the image quality. So we'll crack on. The plan is, what we're going to do is we're going to shoot both of these cameras at the same exposure, the metered exposure. We're going to set a fixed aperture, and then we're just going to raise the shutter speed by one stop at a time. So that will increasingly underexpose that image by one stop at a time. We'll then come back and we'll repeat the exercise, but except this time, when we increase that shutter speed, we'll also increase the ISO by one stop at a time. So we have the correct metered exposure throughout. And then we can compare the, say, for example, 3 stops underexposed with the +3 ISO shot. So for example, if we were shooting at 800 ISO when our metered exposure was 200 ISO, we can compare that to the shot that's 3 stops underexposed and see how they come out. We'll do that back in the studio in Lightroom, but for now let's crack on and get these shots done while the light's nice and consistent. So welcome back. I'm now back in my little office at home in County Durham. I hope you enjoyed the views of Durham, such a gorgeous city and a beautiful place to live, and I absolutely love going there to photograph and take images and video. I've loaded the images back into Lightroom, ready to compare. As with the previous video, the X-T2 X-H2 noise comparison, which you should be able to see just there, I've color coded the images so that red is -1 stop, yellow is -2, green is -3, blue is -4, purple is -5, etc. And they are color coded with the images where I increase the ISO with the aperture, with the shutter speed rather, in order to simulate high ISO. Images have been imported with no noise as a default, so we've got base level images with no adjustments, giving each image is very equal to the other, exposure, colour, all exactly the same. If you're enjoying the video so far, it would be great if you could drop me a like and a subscription. Both of those will help out the channel immensely and inspire me to do more work in terms of Fuji and general photography videos. So let's crack into Lightroom and see what we've got. So here we are in Lightroom and we are in the X-H2 images. This is our base image, which is at 200 ISO. The actual base of the X-H2 is 125, but to keep the comparison consistent with the X-T2, we'll work from the base of the X-T2's 200 ISO. And as you can see quite clearly, we've got -1, -2, -3, -4, -5. And then these shots are where we increase the shutter speed and the ISO at the same time to maintain the exposure. So we're all the way through to this last one here, which is ISO 6400. So what we're going to do, we're going to take the 3-stop under and the 5-stop under, and we're going to increase their exposures by 3 stops and 5 stops respectively in the develop module, and then we'll compare them to the ISO invariant images. So let's start with the 3 stops under. This is shot at 125 of a second, and we'll take that over to the develop module. So you can see we're in the basics section of the develop module, and we're using the exposure tab here and just sliding that up to +3. As we do that, you can see it becomes very similar to the base ISO shot that we did. We'll go back and we'll pick out the 5-stop under image, take that over to the develop module, and we'll increase that by 5 stops, which is actually the maximum you can do on the exposure slider in Lightroom. And as you can see, that's all lit up very similar to the base image as well. So we'll go back to the library module and we're going to compare the image where we've increased the exposure by 3 stops with the image where we've increased the ISO by 3 stops, both the green images here. And if we go down to the little comparison tool down here, the select candidate on the left is the base image at 200 ISO where we've increased the shutter speed by 3 stops, and the candidate image on the right is the image at 1600 ISO where we've increased the ISO and the shutter speed to increase the overall exposure. As you can see, they're pretty similar in terms of exposure, slight differences, but that's to be expected. So we'll zoom in on both images and we'll zoom into this little hut down here, and we'll just wait for this to kick in. There we go. And you can see that the noise levels are pretty comparable actually. If anything, the noise is very slightly better in the one where we've used ISO invariance as opposed to the actual ISO increase on the camera. The noise levels are very, very similar. The sharpness levels are very, very similar. There's really not much to choose between them. Let's come down to the water here. We're at 200 magnification, so that's quite a deep magnification. This is quite interesting when we come down to the water. Now maybe it's just the exposure levels, but the darker shadow areas in the ISO invariant version actually seem to be cleaner, very slightly cleaner than the ones where we've increased the ISO. Let's just bring each of those back to 100, which is obviously a more natural viewing level. And I would say that the ISO invariant one, particularly in the shadow darker areas, is definitely cleaner than the image where we've increased the ISO. So that's quite an interesting result. So let's just go to the 5-stop under, and this is the one where we've used ISO invariance, increased the ISO, and this is the correct exposed image with the plus shutter speed and ISO. And if we click both of those and we go to the XY comparison again, the one on the left is the ISO invariant where we've increased the ISO by 5 stops, and the one on the right is the naturally increased ISO in camera. And again, at 100%, both are noisy. Basically, we're at the equivalent of 6400 ISO here. Both very noisy. But I would say they're pretty much similar in terms of levels of noise. Again, if we come to the darker areas, again, this might just be due to the exposure, but the shadow areas seem actually cleaner in the ISO Invariant version. Might just be because the exposure is slightly darker, but it's not that different. It could be that the ISO Invariant one is holding better contrast. If we just zoom out, there seems to be a slight increase in contrast over the natural ISO one. But overall, it's pretty much the same in terms of noise, apart from the shadow areas where you do seem to see a little bit cleaner noise in the ISO Invariant version as opposed to the natural ISO. So quite interesting, but they're very, very close, and it just basically prove that ISO Invariance definitely is working, and you can use that in your images. So let's go and have a look at the equivalent in the X-T2 now, and we'll do exactly the same, 3 stops under, 5 stops under, and see how well that's dealt with. So here we are over in the X-T2 section, and again what we'll do is we'll pick out this image here, which is 3 stops underexposed, and we'll take that over to the develop module and we'll increase that by 3 stops. There we go, that brightens up nicely to a much more natural looking image. And we'll do exactly the same with the 5-stop image. Take that over to the develop module into the basic tab and slide the exposure to +5. And that's our ISO invariance corrected. So we'll go back to the green one, the 3 stops under, and compare that to the one where we've increased the exposure, the ISO and the shutter speed by 3 stops. And we'll have a look at those two together. Again, the one on the left is the base one increased in ISO invariant, and the one on the right is the one that's had the ISO increased in camera. So we'll zoom in on both, pretty much into the same areas as we did before, and it's pretty similar. I would say that the ISO invariant one on the X-T2 is slightly noisier than the natural ISO version in the X-T2. Very, very slightly. Let's come and have a look at the shadow areas. Pretty much the same. It's certainly at +3 stops. There's very little difference, perhaps a slight increase in noise in the ISO invariant version, kind of to be expected because the X-T2 has a much older sensor and it probably doesn't incorporate such good ISO invariant technology as the X-H2's X-Trans 5 sensor. So this is the 5 stops underexposed, corrected in Lightroom, and this is the naturally increased one in camera. And we'll go to the XY comparison here and just move them round. And again, it does look like the X-T2 doesn't deal with the ISO invariance quite as well as the X-H2. This one is quite visibly noisier than the natural ISO increase compared to the same versions on the X-H2. So the X-H2 invariance is definitely better, even scrolling around. As you can see, there's much better noise control in the X-T2's natural ISO than there is by increasing 5 stops using ISO invariance and Lightroom. That's a much different result. Let's have just a very quick comparison. If we bring up both of these and we go to the X-H2 plus 5-stop invariant and the X-T2 plus 5-stop invariant, like so, and we'll just have a little comparison of those two. Zoom around to there. There's definitely more noise in the X-H2 than compared to the X-T2, but that's because we've got significantly more megapixels, much smaller pixels in the X-H2. You would expect the noise to be slightly higher, and indeed in our previous video about the X-H2, X-T2 noise levels, we did find that the X-T2 was about a stop better in noise control once you got to the higher ISOs of 3200 and above. So it's quite an interesting result. It's quite clear that the X-H2 does have better ISO invariance than the X-T2. To be expected, it's 3 generations newer sensor, and there's a lot more technology packed into it. That said, the noise levels are still higher in the X-H2 compared to the X-T2 when you naturally increase the ISO. However, if you are struggling for shutter speed and you need to keep a high shutter speed for any reason and the light levels are dropping, it is well worth using ISO invariance on the X-H2 in order to get the shot as opposed to increasing the ISO. Certainly at 3 stops under, the ISO invariants seem to be slightly better than the naturally increased ISO, which is quite interesting. Either way, they're useful results, and it does show that ISO invariance is working quite well on the X-H2 if you require it. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, again, drop us a like and a subscription. That would be really helpful for the channel. And any comments, questions, I'm quite happy to answer them in the comments below. And I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.